Jesus gives us the great command to love one another. And earlier on, he will say, there is no greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And so he's talking about the ultimate sacrifice, a sacrifice which is made out of love. It's a love offering. And we might ask the question, how would such a sacrifice of love connect to the book of Revelation? I mean, aren't we in Easter? And I could understand the book of Revelation at the end of the church year, because it's kind of closing everything up and saying, okay, we're ending up this year and now something new is coming. But right in the middle of Easter, when we celebrated the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and Jesus is getting ready to ascend, and the apostles are on fire, and they're going everywhere and preaching the word and doing what they're supposed to. So why Revelation? Well, we have to take it back a little bit. Now, this is the end of the book of Revelation, essentially. So Jesus is saying, I make all things new, and there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and these people will be my people, and I will be their God. Everything is nice, but it wasn't always that way. So the book of Revelation is not a pessimistic book. It's not doom and gloom, as so many people like to remark about it. Oh, this is the apocalyptic. This is everything, all in all. No, it's really a book about a world that was never meant to last forever. That's where we are. This world was never meant to last forever. God forbid it last forever. Because if it lasts forever, we're never getting to the next life. There is never going to be the culmination of everything. Jesus can't make all things new. But if we go back to the 90s, and I don't mean the 1990s, the 1890s, I mean the 90s, the original 90s, the year 90, when the author wrote this book, terrible persecution of Christians. And we're not only talking about the activists who are protesting in front of Caesar, we're talking about women and children. We're talking about the ones who went to Mass, not only they died, but their families. That's the persecution they're speaking of. And so these people are suffering greatly. They're seeing their families diminished. Now don't think for a minute all of them were that zealous for the faith. No, not all of them were Christians in their action, the way they lived their life. So there were those Christians that offered to idols, even though they didn't believe in it. There were those Christians that ate meat offered to idols and everything else. They participated in pagan life. I'm not talking about them, because they weren't suffering. They were uncomfortable. And I want to differentiate between those two. Because sometimes when we talk about suffering, we're not really talking about suffering at all. We're talking about discomfort. My nephews, when they're in the woods and they don't get their 4G, or they don't have enough bars on their phone, say they are suffering. To me, that's discomfort. You know, we sit on these hard benches out here, and people might say, I'm suffering. Well, for most, that's discomfort. If you have some spinal ailment or something else, that actually could be suffering. That we think that something's boring and we have to sit through it and we are suffering. No, that's discomfort. These people in the 90s were losing their lives. They were losing their homes and their land. They were losing any inheritance. And they were losing it for this Christ. For the love of this Christ. And so we can endure almost anything if we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that is the book of Revelation for these people. They're saying, I don't mind suffering for our Lord, but will it ever end? Are we always going to be oppressed? Is there any vindication for us? And the writer of Revelation is saying yes. For those who hold out to the end, even the apostles are saying it in the Acts. They're saying, you know, we're reaching for this salvation through suffering, through difficulty. It's going to take some of that. And so the message of the book of Revelation is not only about finding hope in suffering, but about embracing suffering. Now, lest you think I'm some kind of masochist, we cannot avoid suffering. I'm not saying chase after it. I'm not going to chase after it. Someone would be abnormal who would chase after suffering. But we're going to encounter it. And we can react to suffering with resentment and hatred and say, I don't deserve this, and we can complain and get angry, and that's all we have. We're in pain and suffering, and now we're angry and we're resentful. That's all we have. But if we can find meaning in that suffering, if we can allow it to move us forward, because in the spiritual life there is no standing still. You're either moving forward or backwards. If we can allow that suffering to motivate us. There are not many people who will go into rehab without hitting rock bottom. And I would suggest that many of us, if we look back on our life, if we look back in our history, recent or otherwise, and we look back on the biggest changes that we made in our life or our lifestyle, most of the time those changes were preceded by some kind of crisis that we did not welcome and we could not control. And so the way we reacted to that crisis determined how we changed, for better or for worse. It's true. So that, again, I'm not saying that we should pursue suffering, but suffering is a reality. I'm not speaking of discomfort. That when I speak of true suffering, we're talking about the cancer patient, something that they couldn't control, that they have, someone with a congenital illness of some kind. I'm talking about the parent who sees their child and can do nothing for them, regardless of whether it's a medical condition or a psychological condition or just a consequence of their actions. I'm speaking about the person who is mentally ill and the family members who have to deal with that person. I'm talking about the person who's lost a job after many, many years and had all this security, and their family who suffers with them. This is the suffering that I'm speaking of. Not discomfort, but real, true suffering. Things that none of us would welcome at all, and yet we have it placed before us. This is the cup that we do not want to drink. We're in good company there. It's the cup we do not want to drink, but we must. And so if we must drink it, can we not at least find meaning in that? And if we can find meaning in our greatest suffering, and we can allow that to move us forward from where we are now in the spiritual life, well then that suffering, much like the suffering of Christ, which is done out of the greatest love, that suffering will then become redemptive.